preaching series is on Dinner with Jesus, where we work our way through Luke's gospel and look at some of the encounters that Jesus had with people around him, and particularly with food, people that he met and he engaged with, and to see how these meals that he had were truly transformative. They had an impact on the people that Jesus was with. Meals matter, don't they? I think it's probably every human culture, eating is about way more than just nutrition. In the animal kingdom, eating is a vulnerable time, isn't it? If you kind of see any of these David Attenborough-style documentaries, you see animals who, of course, have their head down, focusing on eating what is in front of them, and not necessarily, or at all times, aware of praying eyes that might be around them. Eating can be a vulnerable time. Meals, though, are also a place of welcome and of friendship, of intimacy, of love shared. When you invite someone to your table, you're giving them a window into your life. And around a table, barriers can come down, conversations can open up. Anthropologist Mary Douglas describes meals also as boundary markers, because who we eat with says something about belonging, acceptance, and relationship with others. And even in the ordinary rhythms of our lives, something so ordinary as eating can be something that becomes a sacred thing, a holy thing. Who here kind of pauses to say grace before their meal? Does anyone give thanks before their meal? We do, not at breakfast. Never quite worked out why we don't do it at breakfast, but we don't very often. But saying grace before our meals isn't just an empty ritual. It's a way of recognizing that something very ordinary that we do every day can also be something infused with the life of God. Food reminds us that life is received to each one of us as a gift. And that's why also we see meals are so significant in the ministry of Jesus. One theologian puts it like this: Jesus got himself crucified by the way he ate. Jesus got himself crucified by the way he ate. He shared meals with all of the wrong people: tax collectors, sinners, non-Jews or Gentiles, prostitutes, the ceremonially unclean. And he was often criticized as being a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. I'm not sure that was meant as a compliment to you. It kind of reminds me of that quote by George Best. You know George Best, the Man United football player? He said he spent loads of money on booze, birds, and fast cars. The rest he just squandered. I love that quote. I don't know why I'm relating that to Jesus. It's not quite so relevant. But Jesus was seen as someone who ate with all the wrong people. And in Luke's gospel, we see, as I said earlier on, that Jesus and food are kind of related over 50 times just in the Gospel of Luke. A Franciscan monk who is called Robert Carris said this, as I said earlier on: Jesus in Luke's gospel is either going to a meal, at a meal, or coming from a meal. Jesus seemed to like eating. And another great author, Tim Chester, puts it like this, because, of course, meals are not incidental to Jesus' ministry. They are central to it. And he says, you know what, I think there's more than just, and that's more than just a helpful idea. There's method in what's going on there. Tim Chester, who wrote a book called A Meal with Jesus, which is about communion, that we've just shared together, points out that actually in Luke's gospel, it mentions the phrase, the Son of Man came, twice. On one occasion, Jesus is eating a meal with a man named Zacchaeus. And when he's talking to Zacchaeus, he says to him, the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. And Tim Chester says, what we see there is Jesus is talking about his mission, what he's come to do. His mission is to seek and to save the lost. That's in Luke 19. But in Luke 7, Jesus uses that same phrase, the Son of Man came. And this time, Jesus is described as the Son of Man came, eating and drinking. Luke 7. And Tim Chester points out that actually, if his mission was to come and to seek and save the lost, his method involved food and drink. Jesus was one who came to eat with us. And in a culture like ours, shaped so often by sound bites and by hurry and by distraction, meals remain one of the simplest and the most profound ways of listening to others, of sharing with others, of being someone who makes space for others around us. And there's a challenge for us because, each of us every day, hopefully, take the chance to eat. Hopefully 3 square meals a day. But can we do that in such a way that is intentional? To use how we eat, to use it as an opportunity for prayer, to use it as an opportunity to talk well with those around us, and to think carefully about who and how we make room for others in our lives through the simple act of eating. And so let's look at our passage in Luke 5 and verse 27 particularly. It says, after this, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector by the name of Levi sitting in his tax booth. Now, what we read here as Levi in Luke 5, if you read Matthew or Mark, he would often be described as not Levi, but Matthew. It's the same person. One of the disciples of Jesus. Matthew here in Luke called Levi. And it describes Levi here as a tax collector. Now, this means that he was someone who was working alongside the Roman occupiers of Israel at the time. If you're not familiar, at the time, the Roman Empire included within it Israel, and the Romans used taxation as a way of controlling their subjects. Kind of feels very familiar, doesn't it? But what they would often do is they wouldn't simply collect taxes from their subjects. They would use intermediaries. They would use people who often would be from the culture that they were subjecting. In this case, the Jews. And what they would do is that they would find people who would collaborate with them and ask them to be the ones who collected taxes from their own people. And, there's some debate about exactly kind of how this works. Some people think that these tax collectors would be people of real means themselves, and they would pay the quota up front, the taxes up front to the Roman people, and then collect it. Others say they collect it and then give it to the Romans. It actually doesn't matter that much. But what we see is that these tax collectors would be given an amount of money to collect from their population, usually a high amount of money that would put their people in subjugation. Financial poverty, financial dire straits. But these tax collectors would be allowed to collect more than the amount that would need to go to the Romans. And they would be able to siphon off and keep as their payment, if you like, the difference between what they had to give to the Romans and what they collected from the people. As you can imagine, that left things wide open for corruption and for nepotism. And these tax collectors weren't the flavour of the month in Jewish society, as you can well imagine. If you were someone who got on the wrong side of a tax collector, you would have the power of Roman soldiers and the Roman state at your door. You would find yourselves in trouble with the occupying power. And so what we see here is Jesus walking along, sees this man, Levi, a tax collector, in his booth where he collects his taxes. Levi would have been seen as someone who had betrayed his own people for personal gain. Now we can infer that what that would also mean is he would be quite unpopular in his local community. And he may well not have been popular even with his own family and his own friends. He would very likely be a broken man, but also a wealthy one too. Now, whether he was personally aggressive towards others, we don't know. But tax collectors would rely on force and intimidation of others to get what they wanted. Who here's watched The Chosen? If you've watched the Chosen TV programme, you know, the presentation of Matthew there is quite interesting in that. He's presented as a socially awkward, isolated man. But in reality, someone like in Levi's position may well have had other people doing the dirty work for him. But either way, Levi was someone we can assume that would have been carrying some shame. Perhaps some regret about the way in which his life was working out. Shame in terms of the way others viewed him. Shame in terms of the person he himself had become. He'd be wealthy, but he'd also be relatively cut off from the people around him. He'd be powerful, but would he really be respected in his community? We can assume not. And yet Jesus sees Levi. Jesus includes him in the new community that he's forming. And again, Jesus sees dignity and possibility in people that society has dismissed. And what we see here is that the kingdom of God is a place where the image of God is recognized in people that others overlook. And that should be a challenge to us as a church, shouldn't it? You know, as I look at Portishead, I see a place that's quite an aspirational place to live, don't you think? It's lovely. It's beautiful. We've got some wonderful views. We have amazing schools here. We're stood in one right now. People move to Portishead because the schools are so good, don't they? People struggle to live in Portishead because the house prices are so high. Why? Because it's a desirable place to live. And the challenge for us is actually, will we simply be a place of comfort for the comfortable? Or is church to be a place, as I think, a place of welcome for everyone? The misfits and those who appear to have it all together. And actually what we see here is, I think, a challenge to us. Are we willing to become uncomfortable? To have people amongst us, as we've seen, who aren't necessarily the typical Portishead resident, in order to become genuinely welcoming of others. We want church to be a place where people who feel out of place encounter surprising grace. The kind of place where people might say, do you know what? Church isn't for people like me. Discover that Jesus has already made room for them. Welcoming people who are not always like me, who don't live like me. And doing so can be a costly thing and a risky thing. But I think it's the church's calling to be a place where people have an encounter with the welcome of God. And I think this year, this is one of the things that I think has been very much on my heart and my mind. You know, one of the things that the Lord has been doing amongst us as his community. You know, as I look at our church, I recognise that there's something of the DNA of GVC that has always been about being committed to meeting the needs of our community. And a place where we want to be welcoming to all, especially to those who don't feel that they would ordinarily belong in church. People who think, maybe church isn't a place where I belong. Maybe I don't talk right, or I haven't been educated right. Maybe I don't look right. And they find this place to be a place of surprising welcome for them. One of the things I've been praying about this year is how we hold together being a church made up of people from lots of different and diverse backgrounds. One of the words we had right at the start of this year in prayer week, and we had it in the year's prayer week as well, is Ezekiel chapter 17. And it talks there about birds of every kind will nest in place. They'll find shelter in the shades of its branches. And I come back to that regularly in prayers and my thoughts about church life. Do when Ruth and I were deciding to move to Portishead, a wonderful word from a good friend of ours. And what he said to Ruth, to I, in moving to Portishead is something I felt that the Lord was saying to him. It's a prophetic word. And what he said was this: you'll work alongside a team of people from mixed backgrounds. And I've got to be honest, I kind of looked at that and thought, what does it mean by that? Has he been to Portishead? It's kind of fairly homogenous at times, isn't it? What does that mean? And actually, I think what we found over the last years is that actually what God is doing amongst us as his community is bringing all sorts of different people and a wonderful sense of diversity to us as his church. And I think what we're seeing is that happening. God's love is visible to all. And so we want a place of welcome and of belonging for people who might be the typical residents of Portishead, if you like, but also for those who maybe don't feel for lots of reasons that they fit the mold that extends the welcome of God. And what we see here is Jesus sees Levi. What does he say to Levi? He says this: follow me. Follow me, Jesus said to him. And we read Levi got up and left everything and followed him. And we see this striking thing that not only does Jesus see Levi, he doesn't see his greed or his compromise or his reputation. He sees the person beneath it all. And before Levi has done anything, he still presumably stood in his booth. Before he repents, before he leaves that booth of his, before all those things, Jesus looks at him and calls him. And that's the scandal and the beauty of God's grace at work. Jesus sees each of us in our sin more clearly than anyone else sees. He sees the secret things of each of our lives. He knows us better than the closest people who know us. And yet he sees beyond some of the mess. And he calls us to become and to follow him. And the calling of Levi is astonishing, not just because it doesn't start with a moral demand from Jesus. Sort yourself out first and then you can follow. You give it a week and you can follow. After 6 months or so, if you're kind of on the right path, if you're moving in the right direction, then come follow me. No, he just says, follow me. Jesus moves toward Levi before Levi has cleaned himself. But look at Levi's response. Levi's response is equally as astonishing. What does he do? In a heartbeat, he leaves behind his security and his wealth, his identity, his old loyalties, follows Jesus. Now, just before Jesus has been calling the fishermen. and they've left everything and followed Jesus too. But do you know, it's interesting that if we read at the end of the Gospels, what happened when Jesus died and the disciples are bereft, what do the fishermen do? They go back to their former employment, don't they? They go back to the fishing boat and start fishing. They are able to return to their old world. Levi would not be able to do that. Once he burnt his bridges with the Roman Empire, he can't go back. Once he's given away his wealth, he can't have it back. It's an irreversible move for Levi. And yet what he does in a heartbeat is he drops it all and he follows Jesus. And then what do we see? What's Jesus' posture? Jesus doesn't preach from a distance. He then reclines with them at a banquet. Levi, having followed Jesus, the first thing he does is he throws a party. You know, the church exists not just for people who are already inside it, but for those who are not yet members of the church. And so the question for us is actually, are our lives creating accessible spaces where people far from God can encounter him? And the truth is, I think for most of us, mission won't mainly happen on a platform or through a program or through a course that we run or a part of. But it will happen through ordinary hospitality, conversation, and shared lives. And what Levi does in experiencing the wealth of God in Jesus is he throws a party for his friends. And who are his friends? Well, it says, doesn't it? The tax collectors. Others, whoever the others are. But you can kind of assume, can't you? There's a bit like him. And so what we see here is that the Pharisees get a bit het up about all this, don't they? The Pharisees and the teachers of the law who belong to their sect complains to his disciples, to Jesus' disciples, why do you eat with and drink with tax collectors and sinners? And Jesus answered them, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but those who are ill. I want to suggest to you that I think the Pharisees get a bit of a hard rap. You know, often we hold the Pharisees up, which is a sect within the Jewish nation who believed certain things about what it would look like for God's kingdom to come on earth, and so kept very closely and very strictly to the laws of God and added a few on themselves too. I want to suggest that actually they get given a bit of a hard time. You know, I read one person here who said, you should be careful not to give the Pharisees a pharisectomy. Anyway, you know, if I'm honest, I'm not sure I've got the intellect to be a Pharisee, but I probably have got the judgmental spirit. And what we see here is that the Pharisees are concerned about who Jesus is eating and drinking with. And their concern relates to holiness. I don't know if you have seen any of the Bible Project videos.
What it's really describing is how God is the creative force behind the whole universe. The one and only being with the power to make a world full of such beauty and life. And so all these abilities,
and what they
make
say
God
is that actually in
utterly
many
unique,
passages,
which
you can
is
see
the
this in
meaning
the Old
of the word
Testament,
holy.
the holiness
So
of
a
God is
helpful
a
way to
little
think
bit
about
like
God's
the
holiness
sun.
is by using the sun as a
What
metaphor.
is the sun? Well,
The
it's
sun
a
is
wonderful,
unique,
life-giving,
at least within our solar
beautiful
system,
thing,
and it's
isn't it?
really powerful.
It's
the
unique,
source
it's
of all
powerful.
this beautiful life on
It's
our planet.
the
And so you
source
could
of all
say
life.
that the sun is holy.
But
And you
what
can actually take this
happens
metaphor
if you
even
get
further,
too close
in that
to
the whole
sun?
area around the sun is also
You burn,
holy.
right?
Yeah, because
You
the
get
closer
too
you get
close
to the sun, the
it
more
hurts
intense
you.
it gets.
Yeah,
Got
exactly.
their little
So
sun
that
tour going
very
off there.
power
Get too
and
close, what
goodness
happens?
that generates all this life is
That's happened.
also dangerous. I mean, the sun,
Get
if you
too
get
close
too
to
close,
God, in other
will
words, this
annihilate
viewers.
you. And in the same
Get
way,
too close
there's
to
this
the
paradox
holiness
at
of
the
God,
heart of God's own
and you
holiness.
burn
Because
up.
if you're impure,
God is holy.
His presence is dangerous.
And in the face of that holiness, we haven't got a chance. We burn up. We get close to him.
And so the first time we see this
and what we see in the Old
paradox of
Testament
God's
is lots of
holiness, it's in the
examples of
story
where
of
this kind
Moses
of
and the
thing
burning
seems to
bush.
happen.
So God tells Moses to
Do you
take
know, I
off
was
his
reading the other
sandals
week in Numbers
because he's
16,
standing on holy
a
ground.
passage where
And Moses
people
covers
have done
his
things
face in
against
fear,
God's law.
and God says, hey,
And
don't
what
come
happens? The
any
earth
closer. It's intense.
That
and
intensity of
swallows
God's
the people
holiness, this exploration of
against God.
holiness, is
Fire
bigger
comes
and
down
more
from heaven
rich.
and burns them.
What it's really describing is
And there's
how
this
God
idea
is the
that here that
creative
somehow
force
that if
behind the
the
whole
holiness of
universe.
God is a
He's
bit
the
the
one
sun
and only
gets
being
close
power
and you're in
to make the world
And what we
full of
need
such
is someone
beauty
who
and
stand
life.
between us
And so all these abilities, they
stand
make
between
God
us and
utterly
God, to help
unique,
us
which is the
to
meaning of the word
experience
holy.
the wonder
So a helpful
the
way to think
beauty
about
of
God's
God's
holiness is by
but
using
not
the
be
sun
burned
as a
up
metaphor.
by it.
The sun is unique, at least within our solar
And where these
system. It's
Pharisees,
really
I think, are coming
powerful.
from
It's
is
the
this.
source of all
Says,
on our
do
planet.
you know what,
And
guys?
so you
know,
could
if you
say
make
that the
yourself
sun
unclean,
is holy. And you can actually take this metaphor even
the
further,
holiness of God
in
is
that the
gonna be
whole
at work,
area
it's gonna
around
burn
the
you.
sun is all
you're not going
Yeah,
to
because the
be
closer you
in
get to the
line
sun,
with God's way
the more
doing
intense
things.
it
So
gets.
why
Yeah,
is
exactly.
this man
that
who
very
says
power
from
and
God
goodness that
eating
generates
with
all this
sinners,
life is
with tax
also
collectors?
dangerous. I mean, the sun, if you get too close, will
And what
annihilate
Jesus
you.
does
And in the same way, there's
is
this
he turns
paradox
this
at the
whole
heart of
idea
God's own
on
holiness.
its head.
Because if you this man, Jesus,
And what we
and he
see
claims
in
that
the
he's
person
fulfilling
of
all
Jesus
of these
here
ancient
is the whole
visions,
thing
but
gets
in
turned upside
surprising
down.
new ways.
'Cause in
So
him
Jesus, he went
something
around touching
astonishing
people who
happens.
are impure, people
Jesus,
with skin diseases,
in
a woman
holiness,
with chronic bleeding, or dead
doesn't
people.
retreat
And
from
when he
sinners.
touches them, their impurity
towards
should
them.
transfer over to Jesus.
He doesn't
But
have the view
instead,
that actually,
Jesus' purity
if he gets
transfers
too close
to them
unclean people,
and actually
their
heals their
uncleanness will
body. This
transfer
man,
from them
Jesus.
to him.
And he claims that he's fulfilling
see
all of
rather
these ancient
is
visions,
that
but
the
in surprising new
holiness
ways.
And the
So
perfection
Jesus,
of
he went around
Jesus,
touching people
the
who are
cleansing
impure,
hands
people
of
with skin
Jesus
diseases, a woman with
transfer
chronic
from him
bleeding, or dead
to those
people.
around him.
And when he
You know,
touches
in Mark
them,
1,
their
Jesus heals a
impurity
leper.
should transfer over to Jesus.
And under the law,
But
touching a
instead,
leper
Jesus' purity
would normally
transfers
make
to
you
them
unclean.
and actually heals their body. This
What does Jesus do?
Jesus. He claims that
He
he's
touched the
fulfilling
leper.
all of these ancient
What happened?
visions in surprising
Well, the
new ways.
Uncleanness of the
So
leper
Jesus,
doesn't
he went
transfer
around
onto
touching
Jesus.
people who are
The opposite
impure,
happens.
people with
Jesus
skin
heals
diseases,
the
a woman
leper.
with chronic bleeding, or dead people.
And what we see
And when he
there is the
touches them,
excluded are
their
welcomed.
impurity should transfer
And that's
over
why
to
Jesus
Jesus.
describes
But
himself
instead,
in this
Jesus'
passage
purity
not as a
transfers to
judge,
them and actually
standing
heals
at a
their body.
distance,
This man, Jesus.
pronouncing
And he
judgment
claims
on
that
God's
he's
people.
fulfilling all of these
What
ancient
he does
visions in
is he comes
surprising
near to
new
people,
ways.
and
So
what he
Jesus, he went
says
around
is,
touching
"I've not
people
come
who
as a
are
judge.
impure, people
I've
with
come
skin diseases,
bit
a
like a
woman with
doctor."
chronic bleeding, or dead people. And when he touches
And what we
them,
see there
their impurity
is
should
Jesus saying,
transfer over to
actually,
Jesus.
Pharisees,
But instead,
you've
Jesus' purity
diagnosed
transfers
the
to
wrong
them
problem.
and actually heals their body. This
The
man,
question isn't,
Jesus.
why am I
And he
hanging out
claims
with
that he's
sinners and
fulfilling
tax
all of
collectors?
these ancient visions, but in surprising
The
new
real
ways.
question is, don't you realize
So
that
Jesus, he went
everyone
around touching
is
people
sick?
who are impure, people
And Jesus
with skin
mixes with
diseases,
sinners,
a
not
woman with
because,
chronic bleeding, or dead people.
not because
And when he
he's,
touches them,
he's
their
just trying to do
impurity
nice
should
things to
transfer
people.
over to Jesus.
He
But
recognises
instead,
that there's a
Jesus'
need,
purity transfers to them
and
and
that it's
actually
in him there's a
heals their
cure.
body. This man, Jesus.
And in
And
Jesus
he
we
claims
find
that
God
he's
is not
fulfilling
less
all of these
holy
ancient
than we imagined,
visions, but in surprising new ways.
but actually God is more
So Jesus,
holy,
he went around
more
touching
merciful,
people who are impure,
and that there's
people
a place
with
in
skin
him
diseases,
for
a
healing
woman with
for
chronic
those who are
bleeding, or
aware
dead
that they have a
people.
need.
And when he touches them,
And so as we
their
begin this
impurity
series,
should
and
transfer over
perhaps
to
the question
Jesus.
is not,
But instead,
who would
Jesus'
Jesus eat
purity
with?
transfers to them
So we're going to see
and
lots of
actually
examples of who
heals their
Jesus
body.
eats
This
with.
man, Jesus.
But
And he
for
claims
us,
that
who
he's
are we
fulfilling
making
all
room
of these
for?
ancient visions, but in
And my prayer as
surprising
we go
new
through this
ways.
series is that we
So
become a
Jesus,
church
he
that
went around
reflects the
touching
welcome
people
of
who
Jesus.
are impure, people
A
with
place
skin
full of
diseases,
grace
a
and
woman
truth.
with chronic bleeding,
A
or dead
place where
people.
we become more
And when he
deeply
touches
rooted
them,
in the holiness
their impurity
of
should
God.
transfer over
A
to
place
Jesus.
where we're unafraid to draw near to people who have a longing to be seen and known and loved by this community. And so as I close, I just want us to reflect for a moment using these questions. Who would I struggle to imagine sitting at Jesus' table? Who would I struggle to imagine sitting at Jesus' table? Is my life genuinely open and hospitable to people who are far from faith? And in this story, where do I most recognize myself? It might be Levi. It might be the Pharisees. It might be somewhere in between those extremes. And I also want us, if you like, to evaluate how we eat. To look at the rhythms of our eating at home and at work, or out and about, and how we can use the meals that we share as spaces for deeper conversation, of welcome, and of relationship with others. And so as I close, I want to leave us with an action. And that's that in the coming weeks, would you invite someone to share a meal with you? Now, we're not talking here about throwing a massive dinner party, although they would be good too. Your home might not be appropriate for that kind of thing, and that might not be your deal, and that's completely okay. But simply and straightforwardly sharing a meal with someone else, or perhaps even a coffee, some simple hospitality with others over the coming weeks. Not something that is impressive or expensive, but something that's welcoming. And seeing what you can learn from sitting alongside others.